Welcome to the second of the weekly vlogs. This one's on the Good Samaritan. So each week we're thinking of a new theme. Start the Week is the overall title, so that we can be thinking from Sunday afternoon or Monday morning onwards about some themes that might guide us through the week or give us something to reflect on. Now, the Good Samaritan is such a well-known story. People have heard of it, people of strong Christian faith, people of no faith at all. This is a very well-known story. It's built around a kind of oxymoron, a good Samaritan, a bit like an exciting accountant, or as someone said to me rather wryly, a brief preacher. And those two words together just don't seem to work. A good Samaritan, and certainly wouldn't have worked well for the people of the first century. It's a story that's been referenced by all sorts of famous people in speeches in both history and more recently. Martin Luther King actually referred to this in a very famous speech the night before he was assassinated. He'd been with his wife to Israel, actually. He was referencing the journey from Jerusalem down to Jericho and what a tortuous, winding road it was, and how it must have been pretty rough and ready territory. No wonder someone was able to come along and mug the man who was walking down that path. Margaret Thatcher famously referred to this passage saying, well, the Good Samaritan wouldn't have been much good unless he'd have had some money. So presumably she was making an employment or a capitalism sort of allusion from this parable. Well, what's the parable about? So just to repeat the story before we read one or two of the words from Luke's Gospel. It's incredibly well known, but as a guy going off on a journey, not quite sure why he's taking the journey, but it's pretty much all downhill from the heights of Jerusalem down through to a city that's pretty much parallel with the Dead Sea. So it's below sea level. Jericho, one of the oldest cities in the world. So this guy's wandering around down there seemingly on his own, according to the story which Jesus tells. And he finds himself, as is not surprising, someone travelling on their own, falls victim to some local thugs who, looking for a quick buck, trying to make some money on the side, rob him and are not careful in the robbery. It's a mugging with violence, and so he's left wounded, bleeding on the side of the road. Now this is a path which is not altogether, untravelled. So other people are passing by. Presumably the thieves must have known that, and the mugging's both violent but also quick, so that they can scarper off back into the Judean wilderness undetected. So our poor hero is lying there, bloodied and beaten, and various characters come down the road and see him. There's a priest and a Levite, individuals with sort of religious roles, both very well known to the Jewish audience which Jesus is speaking to. There's somewhat surprise in Jesus' mind, perhaps, or at least in his voice, and the Jewish audience would have been a little taken aback. These guys don't stop and help. Surely just common humanity would have caused them to help, never mind their religious role. Anyway, they go sauntering on past. But who should rock up but a man from Samaria? And here you get this kind of drum roll in the background. If this had been a film and there'd have been sort of musical accompaniment to this story, you'd have had, wow, this is the moment when the cavalry come charging over the hill. Here's this Samaritan and he can't walk past. He's appalled by what he sees. So he picks the guy up and anoints him with the oil and wine, the Bible tells us, probably some sort of disinfectant in both of these, and wraps his wounds up so that the bleeding is not both staunch, the blood flow, and it's not exposed to infection. And then he takes him off to a local bed and breakfast, some equivalent of an Airbnb or something locally, an inn, a hostelry, and says to the innkeeper, now please look after this guy because he's obviously pretty roughed up, and here's 2 silver coins, the story says, 2 denarii in the original, enough cash to keep you going, to look after him for a while and to feed him and so on, and thanks for doing that, and I'll come back at some point, he says, and I'll give you anything I owe you, because you might need to spend more than these 2 silver coins. And Jesus wonderfully relates this story, Jesus the master storyteller, and the story's found in Luke's Gospel and chapter 10 from verse 25 onwards, a great dramatic retelling of this story. And it begins, on one occasion, an expert in the law, a lawyer, stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus has clearly been wandering around talking about his message from God, that the arrival of the kingdom has come, his wonderful gift of life is available, and this lawyer wants to know what he should do to get it. Well, said Jesus, you know about the law, you've read that, love God in this deep and committed and incredible way with all your strength and mind, and then he goes on to say in verse 27, love your neighbour as yourself. Well, these are quotations from Deuteronomy and Leviticus in the Old Testament, and surely the guy knows what this is about. It shouldn't be a surprise to him. But somewhat oddly, he says to Jesus, you've answered correctly. Jesus would be pleased to know that he'd got it right. And then he says this, well, do it, says Jesus. Do it and you'll live. Do those things. Love God, love your neighbour. But he, wanting to justify himself, presumably wanting to make himself look good in the eyes of the crowd that had gathered, he said to Jesus, and who is my neighbour? And so in reply to that, Jesus tells the story, the Good Samaritan story. And then in closing the story, in verse 36, Jesus says this, which of these 3, the priest, the Levite, the Samaritan, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, perhaps even through gritted teeth, because he may not have appreciated this story. Don't think he wants the Samaritan to be the good guy. He says, the one who had mercy on him. So Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Go and do that. Just as I told you to love God with all your heart and mind, soul and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. Just as I told you at the beginning, before this story, now I'm telling you at the end, now we've identified what a neighbourly act is. Go and do the same thing. Now, it's pretty well known that the Jews and the Samaritans were neighbours geographically, but at odds with each other for a whole range of reasons which went back into history, religious reasons, ethnic reasons, and no doubt other local tribal priorities. And so the thought is that this Samaritan, seeing a Jew on that side of the road, would be disinclined to help him, not only because he might be fearful the robbers are coming back, and therefore his own life will be at risk, but disinclined to help him because of who he is, on the basis of his religion or ethnicity. He doesn't want anything to do with the Jews, thank you very much. He'll continue on down to Jericho and then presumably head north towards the Samaritan region. Perhaps he's going home. So the shocker in Jesus' story is the contrast between the 2 people who might be thought of were going to help and the person who actually helps, the Good Samaritan. And then the command of Jesus, listen, if you want to be an inheritor of eternal life, you've got to love God with every bit of your being, and then that's got to emanate in some action, and it's specifically to those who you don't necessarily feel comfortable with. Now, this is an incredible challenge and an action point for us really this week as we try and live out our Christian lives, emerging slowly as we are throughout most of the world from containment into a larger degree of relational connectivity. We're going to bump into more and more people. Rather strangely, here in the UK, the government have passed an edict that we've got to wear masks when we're in shops from this week onwards. Seems a rather bizarre thing to be saying at a point when everybody agrees that the virus is in retreat. We weren't asked to do this when it was at its height in April. But anyway, one of the challenges of wearing a mask and being relational is hard to recognise people. How will you know who they are behind their mask? Greeting friends in public is going to be quite tricky. Because facial recognition is how we get who our friends are. Oh, I know them, that's a neighbour, that's someone across the road, that's one of my friends. In a mask, that might be a good deal trickier. So as we emerge into some sort of semi-normality, we're going to be more relationally connected because we're going to be encouraged to go back to our place of work or out more, and hotels are opening up around the world, and holiday campsites, and people can fly or use public transport far more. We're going to be connecting with people. And as that happens, there will be an opportunity to connect with people who we wouldn't naturally choose to connect with. And the Bible's quite clear that our love, our expression of faith, is not just to be to those who we get on really well with, our fellow Christians or people who are in the same sort of cultural class, the same language, the same skin colour as us, not just the people we'd naturally gravitate to, but the people that we wouldn't. Now, this is important in contemporary society for a range of reasons. The explosion of protests around the world because of racial dysfunction, bigotry and prejudice reminds us that not everybody feels the same way about another human being. We know that whatever someone's skin colour, human beings are made in the image of God, and therefore bigotry, prejudice, hateful behaviour on the basis of someone's colour of skin or language group or their appearance in some way looking different, Asian, African, Caucasian, these differences can create prejudicial thoughts and actions in the minds of some. Or a different language group, for example. We might be very dismissive of someone who speaks not just a different language, but an accent perhaps from a different part of the country that we view as pretty common or somehow beneath us, as a tendency for prejudice in situations like that. So, as we act this week and increasingly become relationally connected, this is an opportunity to be good Samaritans. That means a practical response to need, of course, but also an emotional, caring response to those around us. Now, how will people be different? Well, they'll be different in all the ways we've thought, just like the Samaritan was different from the Jewish broken man on the road. You'll come across people who have got a different colour skin, born in a different country, different ethnic background and so on. And it's very important in these febrile and excitable times that we go out of our way to be honouring and affirming of people who are different from us. Not in some sort of patronising way, but in a kind of normal way, to make sure that our behaviour is in no way cruel or unkind or dismissive of other people. So that's an obvious example of how we can have good Samaritan attitudes. But also there'll be people who are different from us in more subtle ways. There'll be people who are out and about without a mask, and some with a mask. And there'll be tension on both sides of that debate. There'll be people not wanting to wear a mask, dismissing it as an irrelevant, far too late, not even very effective against the virus thing to do. Someone said to me recently, why is the government treating us like babies, forcing us to wear a nappy on our face? Well, it's a bit extreme, but here's the thing. People have different views about this, different views about coming out of lockdown, different views about whether you should be back in church already, different views about, oh gosh, so many things. So, here's the thing. People will be different from us in the views they express, and those views will be very strongly held. How can you be a loving person this week to someone who's expressing a view that you don't share, but still you can express kindness and love towards them? And notice that the Good Samaritan did have enough cash on hand to be able to help. And so if we find ourselves in the enormously privileged position of having enough money for our own needs and some left over, to think this week about how we can be the Good Samaritan practically. People all over the world are losing their livelihoods. They're likely to be struggling financially. Do we know who they are? Are there ways that we can help them without appearing to be patronising in any way? How can we support them? What about people who are starving around the developing world, as they are in vast numbers? What could we do about that? Is this the time for a donation to some charitable organisation that's supporting the poorest in Yemen, or some poorer country, perhaps in Latin America? Who knows? But there are lots of opportunities for someone who's very different from you and me, but is a human being made in the image of God, who needs a Good Samaritan to care for them across the ethnic divide, across the racial divide, across the political divide, in fact, across any divide. Our chance this week to look out for people who are different from us and exercise Good Samaritan care. And when we do that practical thing, and I would urge you to look for occasions when you can do that, when we do that practical thing, Jesus said, combining that loving your neighbour with loving God with every fibre of our being, that'll be the way to demonstrate that we have in ourselves the eternal life that Jesus promised. So God bless you this week. Enjoy this story. You'll know it well. Think about it again. And this week, look for opportunities to be a Good Samaritan wherever you go. God bless you.